All right, let's start. Dr. Beydoun, good to see you. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. How are you?
Alhamdulillah. How's life treating you?
Good. Busy.
How's
good to have you here in Michigan.
I appreciate it. We're just coming out of the Bully Bee conference.
We are. We had a great meet and greet with Bilal Muhammad here in Dearborn, UFC fighter.
Yep.
Ranked number 5 in the welterweight division. Great event.
Did he just head out, by the way? Is he gone?
He's actually sitting in the back right now, so maybe you can steal a word with him before you go.
Yeah, I'm going to try to catch him, get the next interview with him, inshallah. Real fast, because I know we have a very tight schedule. I wanted to, in this first part of our interview, to talk about, lead into your book. So I wanted to talk about you and your background, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
You're a law professor. You're a social rights activist, right? How else would you describe yourself?
Law professor, author, kind of like a public thinker, public intellectual. I like to sort of connect the academic work I do with, bringing it to general audiences through social media, public lectures. So I think all of those things.
Okay. Where are you from originally?
So I grew up in this area. I grew up in Detroit on the west side of the city. Was raised in Detroit and in Dearborn. My family originally is from Lebanon and Egypt. I was born in Egypt.
MashaAllah. Okay. When did you come to the U.S.?
We came to the U.S. in 1982. We initially settled in Miami, Florida. We had family in Florida. Mm-hmm. And then
my
father, who was Lebanese, had some family here in Michigan, and they eventually gravitated up north.
Okay.
Yeah.
MashaAllah. So we have about an hour of time. I just want to dive deep into your upbringing, your background, if you don't mind, whatever you want to share, whatever you'd like to share.
For sure.
And then how that shaped you as a person and the work that you do today. Mm-hmm. So you're kind of, it kind of reminds me of myself. Like I'm half Syrian, half Tunisian. You're half Egyptian, half Lebanese. Your father's Shia, your mom's Sunni.
Yep.
So how does that play into what you ended up doing as a career and the stuff that you work on today? Because you have a very large following on Twitter. You like to speak out on Muslim issues worldwide. So do you want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, definitely. I think that. So I think what shaped me most was less so the religious identity of my parents, and more so the context, right? The context in which I grew up in. I grew up in the city of Detroit on the west side, largely black and Arab community. We had economic challenges growing up. I lived in 12 or 13 different homes as a kid all the way up through adolescence. So I think if you were to ask me the handful of things that shaped me the most, it would be economic struggle. Second, living in a city that is deeply segregated. And third, coming up at a time where issues pertaining to the Middle East, whether it be Palestine, Iraq, kind of the emergence. This is before 9/11, obviously.
Yeah.
The sort of like bubbling emergence of terror threat. Those issues, I think, all together entwined in one is what sort of pushed me toward not only a career in social justice, but before that, racial justice. I was really concerned with racism and racial inequality very deeply on the domestic front. So all those things, I think, and yeah, my parents being from different places, of different sects, I think that was a blessing ultimately, because I realized that you didn't have to confine yourself in any way. You can kind of take the good from everything and make it your own, and define yourself according to who you are as an individual.
What do you go by when someone asks? Do you say I'm Lebanese American or Egyptian American?
For me, I'll be honest with you, I'm not very nationalistic. Like, I'm proud of being Lebanese, I'm proud of being Egyptian, but neither of those two things define me, right? I'm proud of being Muslim. But above all, I think that for me, especially now that I'm aging, I think what defines an individual is how they see the world, what their principles are, what their commitments are. So I'm all those things, but none of them sort of like supersede the other.
I gotcha. I usually go by Arab American because, if someone asks where are you from, I say Syrian. Yeah. But I usually go by Arab American because I think Arab American defines me more than Syrian American or TMP. Because I, like you, I don't have an affinity towards those countries as much. I'm born here, I'm raised here. For sure. So that's usually what I go by.
But you're Tunisian, I'm Egyptian, so we're African also, right?
Exactly.
So all these identities are social constructions, right? And I think what's beautiful is that we get to define ourselves in ways that we see most optimal.
Exactly. Now, growing up, were you ever socially profiled?
Oh, yeah, 100%, man. Like, growing up in this community, you experience, like, racial, religious, economic profiling in a series of ways. I grew up in an area that was, again, Arab and black, right?
Yeah.
So black folk will define you in a specific way. Hey, you're this rich kid whose parents own a gas station. You know, Arab kids define you a specific way because you live in a not as nice neighborhood. Oh, you're poor. This government, obviously, as you age, and specifically after 9/11, defines you along lines of terrorism, in line of what your religion and ethnicity are. So I think you're younger than I am, but part and parcel of being Muslim and Arab American, just a person of color in this country, is we're perpetually being defined by somebody else.
I hear you.
And that's just, you know, an integral part of what our existence is in this country.
Can you give an example of some sort of social profiling that happened? Like, what
Yeah.
was there a time where you were stopped and frisked or something by the cops?
So one of the first experiences I had with police was, so there's a road here in the area, it's Tireman. Tireman divides Arab Dearborn from Black Detroit.
Okay.
And I was walking home one day, it was like a fall day, I was playing basketball with friends, wearing like gym clothes pretty much, backpack, a hoodie, so the police couldn't identify what I was racially.
Yeah.
And I remember the police pulled up to me, just talking to me very disrespectfully, rudely. Hey boy, remove your hoodie, what are you doing here? And I was like 14 or 15 at the time, and that was my first real stark experience with law enforcement, and just realized that, hey man, like law enforcement, policing in this country view specific individuals who look like us in wrong ways. So that was like, I think, an eye-opening experience. And obviously after 9/11, all the time at the airport. When I was young, I was a visible activist. I had a Palestinian flag on my backpack. I wore a kafiyeh. I was always questioned and profiled at the airport, very routinely.
Wow.
Yeah.
What about the fact that you grew up in not the best neighborhood? You know, you were raised by a single mom.
Yep.
For a better part of your life, and that affected, where you lived, where you went to school. How did that change things for you?
I'm really thankful for that when I reflect on my young years, because I think dealing with economic struggle builds empathy to understand how other marginalized groups deal with systematic racism, deal with systematic inequality, not having the resources to get by and excel in this country. And I think more than anything, even more than being Muslim or Arab, to be honest with you, being poor and working class as a young person in this country is what made me very passionate about issues like affirmative action, issues around education reform, policing reform. So it was hard at the time, but then in retrospect, alhamdulillah, it was something that mobilized me to be active on issues that not a lot of Muslim Americans were vocal about until recently.
Yeah, exactly. Now, and this leads into my next question. When you were studying law, or going towards studying law and working on things that were involved in social activism, and your friends were probably looking towards things like becoming a doctor or an engineer or things with high salaries, did that affect you at all and make you think, I want to have a comfortable job too? Did that affect you at all when you were growing up?
Well, a lot of my earliest friends weren't academically inclined.
Okay.
So when I was a kid and a teenager, a lot of my friends were working at gas stations, party stores, driving cars as valet drivers. They came from very blue collar, working class backgrounds. Later on, when I got to college, I went to University of Michigan. That was a real culture shock for me, because that was the first time I met kids from privilege, right? That grew up in suburbs, had parents who were doctors and lawyers and businessmen and so forth and so on.
So you really went against the grain with that when you picked law school. Yeah.
I mean, for me, because and still today, I've never been like interested or driven by money. We all want money, obviously. We want comfort. We want financial reward for whatever it is that we do. But that was never the primary driver of what I chose to do. I've always been deeply committed to civil rights and social justice. That's why I went to law school. I realized that was the best sort of bridge to do the kind of work that I do today.
I hear you. Okay. So you decided to study law. How does that branch into your social activism in terms of fighting for Muslim rights? What happened? Was there a turning point? I know you spoke about 9/11 in your book, and there's other mentions, of events in the book for you too. What's that pivotal moment, if there is one?
There wasn't a pivotal moment. I've always been a reader. Even when I wasn't always a good student in high school. I flunked the freshman year of high school. I had to go to summer school and night school to graduate on time. But despite my academic struggles early on, I was always a entrenched reader. I always liked to read, and I always liked to read things that spoke to what was happening in the world politically. I mean, whether from a historical perspective or a contemporary perspective. I mean, books like... So, again, there was no epiphany, but it was sort of a gradual buildup. I recall when I was a kid picking up books like Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver, right, who was with the Black Panthers. Books like Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, iconic post-colonial thinker. Edward Said's work, Out of Place, Orientalism. So it was through reading these works that really... So for me, I didn't specifically want to be a lawyer. I always wanted to be a thinker who addressed issues around racial and social justice. The law seemed to be the most sort of strategic bridge to be able to do that. And I didn't just choose to go to law school. I chose to go to UCLA because of their critical race studies program and study critical race theory, which was, again, I think a pretty optimal bridge in connecting being able to practice law and civil rights law, but also engage in some of the intellectual work that I found to be compelling and profound, and that's why I chose to go to law school.
Okay, and just because you touched on it, I saw in a previous interview that you called yourself a critical race theorist. What does that mean? Because if you could just summarize for me, I know critical race theory...
Well, it's under attack right now, politically speaking.
Okay, so do you want to defend your cause?
Sure, yeah. I mean, and I think... So critical race theory is a intellectual movement that emerged in the late 1980s, specifically within the law school context, that essentially stated that we can't talk about injustice, we can't talk about inequality, we can't talk about social stratification and disenfranchisement unless we center race as the sort of most pivotal factor, the most pivotal element in bringing about all of these bad things that are taking place in the United States. So critical race theory, above everything, was an intellectual and sort of like grassroots movement that emphatically talked about the salience of race in systematic racism and oppression in the United States. Critical race theory eventually evolved into a intellectual specialization within law school, and prominent people like Derek Bell. You young folks probably don't know who that is. He was President Obama's mentor when Obama was in law school. People like Kimberly Crenshaw, who's my mentor, who coined the term intersectionality. That term obviously has a lot of resonance and purchase today amongst activists.
Right.
Cheryl Harris wrote a really important piece called Whiteness is Property. So critical race theory just essentially stated that you can't talk about inequality unless we talk about race. And when we talk about race, it's critical to understand that race is a social or political construction that the law essentially wields to promote majoritarian interest, to essentially promote white supremacy. And for me, when I was studying this stuff post 9/11, remember, I went to law school directly after 9/11. Right, I was a first-year law student 2 weeks after the 9/11 terror attacks took place. And I'm studying this stuff, and I'm realizing, hey, in real time, all this crazy stuff is happening with Muslims. Profile, the Patriot Act, surveillance, war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq. But none of these scholars who are doing critical race theory are talking about what's happening to Muslims. There was that real intellectual void. And for me, early on, that was kind of a command to me that I want to dedicate my life to filling that void and engage in this process of knowledge production that addressed what was happening to Arab and Muslim Americans in real time within the movement.
Right. Okay. So you're a big proponent of critical race theory.
Yeah.
That race is the key
well,
thing.
I'm a critical race theorist too, so more
right.
than
Okay. I hear you. So Ben Shapiro and other people on the right would take issue with that because they say if you teach critical race theory in school, that implies white guilt. And it makes white children feel guilty about themselves. Yeah. What would your response to that be?
Well, I think before I answer that question, it's critical to understand that this, if your audience who don't know, there's a national movement within state legislatures to essentially criminalize critical race theory through the passage of laws, right? Michigan, South Carolina, Florida, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But for Muslims, this movement has special significance because we all know what happened with the anti-Sharia law movement for the last 10 to 12 years, right? These same legislators who want to ban critical race theory right now were trying to ban anti-Sharia, were trying to ban Sharia law beforehand, right? So it's part of a broader concerted effort to sort of like criminalize anything that isn't white. Now, people like Ben Shapiro, and I think Ben Shapiro has a following within the Muslim community, if I'm not mistaken. People like him
Possibly.
and Jordan Peterson, some of these right-wing voices are becoming popular amongst different segments of the Muslim community.
Probably not too much, though, because he's very anti-Muslim in his speech. He said one time that 90% of Muslims can be considered terrorists.
Yeah, and Shapiro's also a staunch Zionist, too.
Yeah.
So my response to him, number one, is I think one thing that Shapiro does, and look, I disagree with Shapiro, but he's a smart guy, but he caricatures and distorts what critical race theory is, right? Intentionally. Critical race theory is not anti-white, right? It doesn't categorically sort of indict all white people as being bad or racist. All it does, and I think it's not even a controversial or provocative statement, once you strip it down, is say that this country is built on white supremacy. That is not a radical statement, right? And
what's your evidence for that statement?
there's considerable evidence, right? I can give you legal evidence. So one piece of legislation that I studied really early on is 1 year after the United States became a sovereign nation, there was a law called the Naturalization Act of 1790 that was enacted. And this law was in place until 1952. And this law mandated, right? It made it a full-fledged requirement that somebody had to be white to become a naturalized citizen.
Right.
Explicit in the law, right? That is definitive of white supremacy, right? The idea that you're conflating whiteness with citizenship, which is the greatest prize in the land, right? If you become a citizen, you have an infinite realm of possibilities that you can sort of like achieve in this country. So that is white supremacy, and I think it's critical for Muslims to understand that Islam was racialized as a non-white religion. So until 150 years or so, Muslims could not become naturalized citizens because Islam was thought of as a non-white faith. So that's an example of white supremacy. Another example, obviously, is slavery, right? So the enslavement of African peoples who constructed the very architecture and backbone of this country was built on the backbone of white supremacy. Even if we don't even look at history, if we look at present-day America today, look at the composition of government, look at the composition of the Senate, look at the composition of the House of Representatives, Supreme Court, federal courts. Majority not only white folk, but white men. So that is reflective of white supremacy.
Well, someone might push back and say, well, that was the past. We now have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that guarantees basic rights for everyone. So what's your response to that?
Well, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has been eroded by a range of Supreme Court decisions recently, right? So cases like Shelby, for instance, which have bludgeoned access to voting for people of color, black people specifically in the South. So a lot of the progressive reforms that were spawned by the Civil Rights Act have been diminished and undermined. Affirmative action, for instance, right? LBJ, when he signed the Civil Rights Act, made affirmative action a mandate. The idea that black folks and people of color would have access to quality education moving ahead. Since then, there's been a range of Supreme Court decisions that have narrowed and diminished affirmative action. Now, it's essentially illegal to use race as a metric in many states. So your listeners have to know that the Civil Rights Act has been narrowed and slashed considerably in the 5 or 6 decades since it was enacted.
Does the Patriot Act play into that as well?
Well, the Patriot Act is a distinct piece of law that came into being post 9/11, right? And what the Patriot Act did, it wasn't a pointedly civil rights act. It was an anti-civil rights piece of legislation.
That's what I mean. Did it erode that too, the Civil Rights Act?
Well, it wasn't directly connected to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What the Patriot Act did was it essentially legitimized surveillance of Muslim Americans to say that if you are Muslim, if you go in a specific masajid, if you have cousins in specific countries, wire money to people in specific countries, that your accounts can be frozen, you could be surveilled.
Okay.
But what it does, though, I think the question you're trying to get at is it sort of eats into this broader promise of civil rights that was extended by the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Right. Okay. You mentioned the anti-Sharia bills. Why is that a problem for Muslims? You know, because it was actually passed in South Carolina when I was in South Carolina, and I didn't think that was a big issue. Like, am I missing something? What's the? What happens to me as a Muslim?
The acts were nefarious in a range of ways, right? And I think that so I'm an academic. I'm not going to try to speak too technically about this stuff, but I'll try to strip it down in ways that are as understandable as possible. But the acts were pernicious because basically what they did is they classified anything that would qualify as expression and exercise of Muslim activity as potentially being violative of the anti-Sharia bill. It wasn't always enforced, right? So it's not like you're going to walk to the masjid in Columbia, South Carolina, and a cop was going to pull you over, right? But if a cop or federal law enforcement had it in for you, right? If you were somebody who was a visible activist, somebody who was vocal on Palestine, somebody that the government really wanted to book and really wanted to investigate and prosecute, they can use that law as pretense to essentially, pierce your privacy, right? Your civil liberties. So it gave state legislature and then law enforcement within these states that passed this legislation to essentially crack down on Muslims that they wanted to crack down on. That's on the legal end. On the private end, what it does is it's kind of like the Muslim ban, right? Basically, what it does is it's kind of like rhetorical. It's a rhetorical symbol, if you will, that emboldens private actors, right? Vigilantes, hate mongers on the ground to attack masajid, attack Muslims, vandalize Muslims' homes. It's kind of like a public call to action that Muslims are the bad guys and that the public should partake in this broader sort of campaign to police and punish Muslims.
Okay, I thought the text of the law was that, or not the law, but the bill, was that this bill would not allow foreign law to be applied in those cases where a constitutional right is undermined. Is that...
So you've studied this area kind of closely?
No, I just read it a little bit.
There's various iterations of the law, right? So I would say that there's basically three distinct forms of the anti-Sharia law. Some are what are called facially neutral.
Okay.
And like you just said, they prohibit international law. Some prohibit comparative law. Some are more explicit in nature where they actually name Islam. The Oklahoma bill, for instance, was one of them, in Tennessee's.
Oh, wow.
Which were challenged in court, specifically name Islam. Now, the facially neutral ones that specifically just say international law or foreign law, they were practically enforced against Muslims. Right, so they're facially neutral, but they were the ways in which the court and law enforcement would sort of like practically enforce them would be with Muslims in mind. Kind of like counter-radicalization policing. If you read President Obama's bill on CVE, Muslims aren't mentioned anywhere, but it was actually practically only deployed against Muslims.
I hear you. Okay, so I was just trying to think of how that would affect me on a personal basis. I don't think it would in some cases, right? Like the anti-Sharia bill.
Well, it could, right? So let's say you went to a masjid, for instance, that had presumptive ties to a network or an organization that the state was averse to. So
ISNA, for example.
Say it again?
ISNA, for example.
ISNA, for example. Anything that was implicitly or allegedly linked to the Muslim Brotherhood.
Oh, and that's what they allege. Yeah.
So there was a big push by the advocates of the anti-Sharia bills to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist outfit.
Yeah.
And we all know who do activism in this country, Muslim activism, that there are elements that are directly associated with that outfit.
Right, yeah.
For good, I'm not making a normative assessment of
For
that,
sure, yeah.
right? But that would cripple civic activism, fundraising, political advocacy, if that organization or other organizations were found to be terrorists.
And the reason why, right? Because if we break that apart for a second, the Muslim Brotherhood is not in the U.S. It's a political party in some Muslim countries.
It's a political movement with presence in different Muslim majority countries.
Right, and it has, like, if you go way back, it has, like, some folks that came out of it that founded ISNA and ICNA and other organizations, but there's no direct ties. Yeah, but there's no direct ties between the organizations. So if they go and designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, then it casts a wide net on everyone else to say, you're all terrorists.
And, right? One thing we learned from the war on terror is that you don't need probative or legitimate evidence to investigate or prosecute Muslims, right? It can be hearsay, it can be indirect, it can be fabricated evidence, and that's oftentimes enough. And we've seen that for the last 2 decades of the war on terror.
Yeah, and this is what Ben Shapiro brought up on an interview one time on Fox News with Hassan Shibli, when he was attacking Linda Sarsour for saying we need to wage a jihad against those folks that are, anti-Islam or whatever. And then Hassan responded by saying, yeah, you can't smear a woman that isn't present. And then he said, okay, let's talk about CARE. And he said CARE is an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation, which was funding Hamas, a terrorist organization.
Yeah.
But they're unindicted. Have you heard? Like Eric Love wrote about this in his book Islamophobia. He's with you at the ISPU. Mm-hmm. That this was like some sort of case to pressure Nihat to step down.
Yep.
It was a personal issue between the DOJ and Nihat.
Yeah.
And they went and they put out this thing that said that he's in CARE as an institution is part of this thing. Have you heard about that?
I have. Yeah. I mean, there's been a bunch of studies coming from right-wing think tanks that have tried to pin CARE and conflate them with the Muslim Brotherhood to bring them down, right? I think Penn Shapiro you can classify him as being one of the more prominent public voices of this Islamophobia industry, this cottage industry, which attempts to make those ties, right, with the Holy Land Foundation, with Hamas. They have a very strategic design objective to not only silence but criminalize Muslim American activism in this country by making those links.
I don't understand how that can even be an attack, though. He says unindicted co-conspirator, which means they're not guilty. They're not indicted. So it's just weird that would be.
But you shouldn't. But again, I think what you're doing is you're applying like the normal terms of the rule of law to the war on terror, right? A war on terror baseline is you don't need a full-fledged indictment. You don't need a guilty verdict. You don't need a criminal conviction to sort of cloak a Muslim with the veneer of guilt, right? I think my definition of Islamophobia, and you've read the book, is basically that expressions of Muslim identity are presumptive of terror suspicion, right? Being Muslim and being vocal and being critical and being engaged with specific organizations constructively makes you guilty, and that's enough.
Yep. We're at the half-hour mark here, so just one last thing, and we can wrap up to continue with part two. You're under fire on Twitter right now.
Yeah.
By the Hindutva folks for your support for a Muslim woman in India that was going to school in a hijab, and she was being harassed by a mob of. Do you want to talk about what you came out in support of?
Yeah. So I've been really vocal on what I call Islamophobia as a global phenomenon, and obviously what's taking place in places like India is emblematic of the American war on terror being exported into different nation states, India being one of them. In public colleges in Karnataka, which is in southern India, you've had a number of the colleges impose what are now uniform requirements, and they're veiled attempts, no pun intended, to sort of crack down on Muslim women wearing the hijab to not be able to attend their classes, right? So everybody's seen pictures online of these young girls who are sort of seated outside of their classrooms, studying, reading, because they're forced with the ultimatum of either removing your hijab or you can't come to class. And many of these women are deeply spiritual, devout women who shouldn't have to burden that ultimatum. They want to be able to express their religion the way they see fit and be able to attend class and get their college educations. And in the last couple of days, they've been protesting. And those protests have attracted these Hindu supremacist mobs to come to these colleges in Karnataka and basically menace, intimidate, scare these girls. And I think what's really important to address is there's a pointedly gendered dimension to all of this, right? So these are women, right, who are being slandered and attacked by men, right? So not overlook that gender dimension of it all. But yeah, Hindu supremacy and the way it's been, inflamed by the Modi regime and the BJP, has made India an epicenter of global Islamophobia, and in many ways far more ominous and violent than we saw here in the United States under Trump.
Okay. Some would say that, well, that's just the school dress code that they need to abide by.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
Well, look, India claims that it's the largest democracy in the world, right? And what is democracy? Once you strip down, if you were to strip the definition of democracy to three, let's say, theoretical cornerstones, what would they be? Number one, the people get to vote and decide what the government looks like. India is home to 220 million Muslims.
Right.
It's the second biggest Muslim population in the world. This isn't like a negligible minority group, like it might be in the United States where we might have 3% of the population. Huge population, and they're indigenous. These aren't immigrants. They've always lived in India. This is their country. A second cornerstone of democracy is the idea that every individual, regardless of what faith they are, of what ethnicity they are, get to engage in basically this idea of free exercise of religion, right? When modern India was founded, it was founded on the principle of free exercise of religion. Central to free exercise of religion is being able to express and publicly indicate your religion in the way you dress.
Yeah.
And for Muslim women, one of the ways in which they do that is wearing a hijab. Third way is free speech, the ability to protest, right? The ability to say, if I have a grievance with this state actor, this university, that I get to go out there and protest. These women are functioning democratically. Now, India has a choice, right? If they want to impose these discriminatory uniform requirements, then they're not a democracy. Make a decision. The ultimatum shouldn't be on these women to decide between their faith and their uniform. It's on the nation of India. Are you a democracy? And if you are the world's largest democracy, let these women engage in exercising their faith in line with your constitution. It's that simple.
Got it. Now they're calling you all kinds of things on your Twitter. They're threatening certain things, and they're basically coming out full force against you. They feel like you're attacking everything that they stand for. Does that bother you at all?
No. I mean, I'm from Detroit, man. Like, I grew up fighting, and what folks got to say online is not going to hurt my feelings. You know what I mean?
Okay.
No, and I understand that it's kind of part of the territory. You know what I mean? If you're vocal, and I take great pride. Like, I'm a law professor. I'm an academic. For me, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing unless I had the chance to speak freely on the issues that I care about. I mean, what good is it if I'm writing these books and these articles on Islamophobia, but when something's popping off in China and India, I'm silent, right? Like, I think there's a responsibility for thinkers, intellectuals, scholars, whatever you want to call people that do what I do, to speak, especially with platforms, right? To speak up on issues when things are really taking place. So, I mean, what folks say doesn't really bother me. You know what I mean? Sometimes you get threats and death threats, and you're more concerned about what people might say or do to family members. But I'm very keen on keeping my social media, my private life, disconnected from that.
I hear you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Dr. Beydoun, it was a pleasure. I
Yeah,
appreciate
it was a
your
great
time. We're going to go ahead and close now, and we'll sync back up for part 2, inshallah.
Definitely.
I appreciate it.